As today's program is held in conjunction with the exhibition Ever Present, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country where each First Nations artists reside or where the art in Ever Present was created. We recognize their continuing connections to country, community, and culture and pay our respects to the elders, leaders, and artists past and present. We respectfully acknowledge all First Nations traditional custodians whose art we are currently exhibiting in Singapore. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on a Friday evening. I promise you a nerdy evening on a very important topic, looking at ways of indigenizing the museum database. With us this evening is the lead curator of Ever Present First Peoples Art of Australia, Tina Baum. She is also the curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art at the National Gallery of Australia. Tina will be presenting her talk, Cultural Cataloguing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Collections for Better Museum Practice. We are very fortunate today because it's good to have Tina back in Singapore after her last visit during the opening of the exhibition in May. I'll do a bit of introduction of Tina. Tina is from the Gulumirgin, Larrakia, Wardaman, and Karajari peoples of the Northern Territory and Western Australia. She has over 30 years of experience working in museums and galleries throughout Australia. She has worked at the National Gallery of Australia since 2005, and in 2017 she curated Defying Empire, the third National Indigenous Art Triennial. She is also a recipient of the Australia Council for the Arts Leadership Program between 2020 and 2022, and an alumna of the British Council Accelerate Program to the UK in 2009. She is a mentor to alumni, a presenter, and an organizer of the NGA and Wesfarmers Indigenous Art Leadership and Fellowships Program since 2010. So tonight's talk stems from Tina's experience of working in the registration department at the NGA for over a year. It is through her effort that she has established more meaningful engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, collections, and exhibitions. So we're very excited to have her here tonight. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tina.
Yeah, thank you for joining me on this wonderful Friday evening. Thank you, Z, for the acknowledgement. It's always important to even though we're in Singapore, to do an acknowledgement, because we have, for me, artworks and communities, and we have an artist in town at the moment, Alec Tapodi, as well, who, by the way, will be performing on Saturday and Sunday at 2:30 just outside here. The acknowledgements are really important, a part of what I do at the gallery, as well as a part of who I am as an Aboriginal woman. As part of that acknowledgement, I'd also still like to pay my respects to those that have been affected by the stolen generations as well. It's an important component of what I do in the museums to actually acknowledge those that don't have that continuous connections to their family, their community and their culture. And it's because of, I suppose, those museological practices of the past that quite a few communities in Australia at the moment don't have that connection. So for me, it's important to acknowledge those that were affected by and who experienced the destructive stolen generation policies, like both my grandmothers were taken away, and recognise their journeys to reconnect, revive and reclaim. And that's a really important role that museums play in all of this as well, so it all connects up. So let me do this one. I'd also like to, recognise, and it's not really done all that often, but I'd also like to recognise the Aboriginal leaders, activists and quiet achievers who have since time immemorial been, the strength and the backbone of our communities, and who through their perseverance and determination, foresight and resilience, have paved the way for many of us in the future generations to do what we can do to make meaningful change. As mentioned, I've worked in museums and galleries for over 30 years. Often I'm the only Aboriginal person in these institutions, and you see a lot and you experience a lot. And I do love what I do, but it can be really hard and challenging at times. So for me, it's always important to incorporate images of my country up in Darwin, where I'm from, as well. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audiences, the National Gallery of Singapore staff, and other cultural workers in the audiences as well. We have a really important role to play, and you know, it's great to see so many of us either here today, but also in the sector. I mean, we have just an incredibly important role, which I don't know that general audiences actually realise or appreciate, at least anyway. Hang on. Okay, that's me. So, oh, sorry, camera threw me off. As mentioned, my name is Tina. I'm from the Lee and Kabillo families in Darwin. I have Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Scottish and German ancestry as well. Up in the Northern Territory where I'm from in Darwin, you know, there was a lot of connections that were occurring across the board, and that experience of my ancestors, my family and elders has really informed what I do today across the board in all aspects of my work in the gallery. As mentioned, I had a year's it was fantastic. It was absolutely fantastic. I love working in registration and with conservation, and you know, such unappreciated work as you know, many people know. But when you come from a curatorial background, and you know, when you look at the relationship that all the different departments have working in registration, it really was an eye-opener for me in so many ways. My husband's a registrar at the National Museum of Australia, so we often have these kind of conversations anyway, but I really wanted to you know, talk about my passion with working with the collections, and particularly the database, and my experience of working for a year in registration and the impact it had on me and on my colleagues at work who get their ears chewed on all the time. But today, tent side, I'd like to highlight a few you know, problematic examples of museum methodologies from the past, and how we need to change their applications, particularly when it comes to, as a First Nations woman, so from my perspective, how, you know, we really need to change that, particularly when it comes to our collections and how we would indigenise them as elders would have taught us. So, as mentioned, over 30 years in galleries and museums, I've seen a lot, and I've seen a lot of, I suppose, those hidden collections, if I could put it that way. So I'll come to that a bit later, but it's not just, you know, the objects and the works on paper and the artworks. It's also the human remains, it's the secret, sacred and restricted works as well that were collected. For me, what I've learnt, I've got here, what I've learnt and observed over the year, I have to put it down on notes because I will waffle on this for hours and I don't have the time, unfortunately. But so for me, what I've learnt and observed over the years is that the broader we, as certainly within Australia, and some of us First Nations curators and arts workers are doing already, we need to start with the basics, you know, straight back to the basics of the records, and work our way out of these outdated systems. They really don't fit or suit First Nations collections and artists, even artworks and contemporary works today. You know, we need to look at the practices of, you know, one of the world's longest continuous cultures in the world, and look at how, you know, we can apply, you know, methodologies and knowledge and teachings to museum systems today. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this particular map here. So this is a map that was done by a fellow called Horton, David Horton, who, it gives an indication of the sort of language groups that were in Australia at the time of first contact. It was estimated that there were over 1 million, if not more, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and of course through, within each of those groups there's the sub-clan group. So there were many, many different groups, different cultural practices, different languages, different designs, different works. And of course, I've got here, for generations there was, engagement within the country, across borders and boundaries, as well as overseas, with visitors coming to regularly to Australia. Of course, this all changed when the British came, and trade that was an essential part of what we did was, I suppose, changed. It changed as the British came. So the initial generous trades by the Eora people or the First Nations people that were on the frontier, that generosity of exchange and trade that was there, quickly changed to taking, into a one-way taking or, colonial trophy system, really, where there was a frenzy with museums, galleries and private collectors in obtaining as much as they could of, what was considered we were considered a dying race. So, a lot of that early material that was collected, along with the devastating sort of colonial policies and acts at the time, the culmination of all of these, the removal of these incredibly important cultural objects, as well as, language, culture, and people themselves, really had a big impact, as you can imagine. So, often with a lot of these objects, it was without consent. It wasn't a mutual exchange, and often these works would leave, and the communities wouldn't know where they would actually go. So this is an object that a Larrakia basket that came on the market. It was in a private collector's collection for many years, and it's now back in a private collection, but it's the Larrakia community that actually own this. So there's a lot of, I suppose, reclamation of old material that's out there, whether it's through purchases, whether it's through gifts, whatever means it is, a way of actually getting these works back, because many of these, even though they were made by our ancestors and that, we didn't know that they existed or where they actually went to once they were taken. But this was in private collections, in a private collection in the UK, but it's back here now. So there's it's so incredibly important, and it actually informs a lot of the younger community, the younger artists in the community today, who are attempting to either recreate or interpret these old materials that are actually coming back into the community, and likewise these designs as well. So that revival and that reconnection is so important. It's actually happening in communities again today, when we can access this old material that's out there. So, of course, objects, art, photos, archives, films, audio recordings, people, and materials from archaeological sites are in collections all over the place, often just sitting in storage, as we all know. But, there's many communities out there that are actually engaging with these collections, that are actually reviving their practice with possum skin cloaks, with carving of shields and that as well. So, the museum's collections around the world are really quite important, but, there's still that sort of tension between, access and actually getting the works back. So, what have I got here? what's interesting with a lot of the material, certainly the material that I've seen, of Larrakia material that I've seen overseas, is, you know, when you think about the impact that it has on communities seeing these works as well. I know for material that was in the Oxford Museum, I was the first Larrakia person in well over 100 years to have seen or have spoken language over these objects. And, you know, they're really quite powerful moments. And you don't realise that until you get there and you think, dang, you know, no one's touched or seen these, you know, in all that time when it was taken away. So again, I'll just show a few others. So again, these 19th century materials, you know, the designs, you know, engaging with collection managers this is a spear thrower from the Mcclay Museum in Sydney, and when I was engaging with it, I was looking at it in a very different level to the manager, and, you know, pointing out these really fine, intricate designs on it, which they'd never noticed before, because they didn't look at it in the same way that community members do. So that connection with you know, collections is just so incredibly powerful. Is that one? Again, you know, for us in Darwin, a lot of our cultural knowledge and language, which we're trying to revive at the moment, which we are reviving, that cultural knowledge is not there anymore. So knowing that, you know, we're Dungalapa, we're the crocodile clan, so, you know, knowing that crocodile teeth were used as the spear thrower peg, you know, is really important when it comes to teaching the young ones and saying, these collections are out there, this is what happened, this is what, you know, our ancestors created and made. So, you know, they're now going out, certainly the young men are now going out and actually, you know, trying to, although these spear throwers, I've never seen in all my years a spear thrower like these at all, which is wonderful that they're part of our community, but, you know, the incredible impact that it can have on communities when they engage with them again is you just can't put a cost on that. So again, you know, looking at the colours, the materials, the mates, you know, very unique for our different communities. So, you know, getting that opportunity to work with the old material is and actually even just finding them is just crazy. So when I was looking at, you know, my time in registration, I was also aware of you know, activities that were happening out in the world. So this is a shield that the British Museum have in their collection. It's a very important one, according to their records for many, many years, and it was displayed for over 50 years as a shield that was collected by Captain Cook on Guigal country, which is in Sydney, after an encounter they had with some Guigal men. They fired a shot. The men dropped their, you know, it was written in Cook and Banks's journals that a shield and some spears were dropped, and Cook collected them and took them away. Essentially, he stole them because it wasn't with permission. But in 2016, this shield was on display for all those years, saying this is the shield, this is the one. 2016, the Guigal community, who have heard those stories through oral histories about these objects that were taken, went and put a claim against the shield when it was on display in the National Museum in 2016. And the ripple effect after that was interesting. So when I'm talking about the database, you know, I'm just kind of leading up to that, where, you know, the information that you have in it is just so important. Of course, we all know that. But after the community started making a claim on the shield, saying, well, you've said it's a Guigal shield, we want it back, you took it illegally. The British Museum started to investigate the provenance of the shield and have now said that it's not actually the one. the impact that that can have on the community when you say, yes, it is. And then, you know, I mean, okay, through due diligence and research, and if you discover something that really isn't, that's fine. But because of the claim and the, you know, rightful claim against this particular work, narratives started changing, records started changing, and if you get it wrong, either in the database, because it says on there that it was found unregistered in the collection in 1978, and then, you know, registered with the Q number. Not only does it bring up a number of questions for me, besides the fact that it was on display, I was like, yes, this is the one. This is the British Museum. I mean, I know you know, some things, sometimes it can happen in collections and that, where you find unregistered and, you know, odd objects here and there. But if this was an object that was like, this is the one, its registration was pretty crap for it if it was unregistered in the collections, but been in display as the one. But also, you know, the changing of those records. You know, they've got New South Wales ? You know, Botany Bay ? The impact that it can have on communities if you get the information wrong. Culturally, it can be unsafe for people to, you know, be associated with material that's not from their country. There's a lot of cultural considerations to think about with these particular ones, but you know, it can make a huge difference. But you know, if it wasn't the one, then whose was it? Where was it from? Who made it? You know, what are the details for it? Is that information lost? So, you know, even if it isn't that one, who are the communities that you can connect with to say this is really important? It's an old shield. You know, they've done a lot of studies, and I got really cranky. There was some podcasts. There was a podcast about this particular work. It's a great podcast called "The Stuff the British Stole," and it's fantastic. But they ran a 2-day conference around this particular work. They didn't involve the Gweagal community. They had a lot of academics and historians and other people that really just, you know, had no meaningful connections to this particular work. And of course, with their findings and all, they say that it's not the one because the material, the wood, comes from somewhere else. It's like, well, have you not heard of trade people? Just because it wasn't from material from there, doesn't mean that it's not theirs. You know, if it's owned and used and maintained by communities, it's theirs. So, you know, my poor husband, I was screaming in the car like, you're driving me crazy. So, you know, those sorts of things, these notions where you know, the record can be changed to suit the narrative of the institution also, which is really worrying, either if they get it wrong or if they actually change it. So, as I say, you know, as they say, hidden is written or rewritten in this particular case by the victors, even today, you know, all these years later, despite the records and despite everything that's been documented about it, that can still change today. And the impact that it has on the Gweagal community today is, you know, really quite, you know, hurtful. It's really quite sad to see that, you know, institutions like this have that actual power to say who has and who hasn't got the right to access these particular works. Oh, here we go, another one. This is all the documentation that's on the British Museum website for it. And, you know, they've done scholarly researches and everything, but no one's engaged with the Gweagal community. Yes, it can be really quite, you know, a lot of tension and all, but this needs to happen, you know. I mean, there's often tension when these things occur and get taken in the first place. So, you know, now that its provenance and identity is being disputed by the British Museum, this is, I suppose, one of the key catalysts when it comes to, you know, First Nations collections in Australia. You know, if it was taken, I mean, the majority was just taken without consent. What happens now? You know, I mean, communities have every right to be able to to go and speak to these institutions about, return of these materials. So, besides the fact that, whether it is or isn't the one, the whole sort of cataloguing practices and that behind it, again, draws into questions the British museums, as one of the sort of, supposed, leading premier places. What does that mean for, myself at the National Gallery or the National Museum, the Australian Museum? Getting it right for communities is so important. So in 2019, when I had the opportunity, we had a new director. There was a incredible focus on First Nations first, the presence. We made a whole of institution sort of decision to elevate and give prominence to First Nations voice. So we were doing a lot of displays in that, and I thought our database and the records were not up to scratch, not up to my scratch. And so I spent that year in registration. It was just fantastic. And I chose to catalogue our bark paintings collections because it was certainly one of those works, some of those works that a lot of the other departments were wanting to use. So we've got over 500 small barks that I can actually manage myself and didn't need other staff to assist me with. And I spent 6 to 8 months cataloguing. Each week I'd go and do 50 odd barks, front, side, back, and recording all of the information on the back of them. And it was during this project that in 2019, I turned 50 then too, and I just started, just getting more and more cranky with things. It's like, I'm not putting up with stuff anymore. And I thought, why is this happening? Why are these records the way that they are? I came across this particular work, which is, now we know it is by a particular artist, Peter Marrawonga. On the back of the work, it's the standard, information that we have on the back of our barks with the story and, the art centre's sort of records and information and notes and that. In the corner, there was a note. I was documenting that, if there's any changes in the, movement of, barks being down in Canberra where it's quite cold, it can happen. So I was really interested in measuring and doing what I could for it. So here on the back of the bark, we've got name Marrawonga, tribe is Gunwingu. And so whoever catalogued it at the time, catalogued it as the artist as Marrawonga Gunwingu. There is no such person. And so we could never find, I mean, the spelling of Marrawonga was slightly different too, but we've got a collection of Peter Marrawonga barks. We had another one, but it was catalogued under the wrong one, so we never found it whenever we searched for his name, whenever we wanted to show his works. And so when you look at the particular work, the story and the information there again, if the individual is not aware of those cultural sensitivities or understandings of how the records or the works were actually, documented by the Art Centre, then they could get it wrong, and they did. They got it wrong. This is one, of course, on the right that is definitely his, and of course the similarities and the stylistic designs were the same. And so through a whole process, I was able to, again, to get that acknowledged appropriately and to let the community know that we now have 21 barks by this particular artist, because there were several of them that were actually catalogued this way. So, we didn't know about these other barks that, we potentially, could have used in displays. And, it really made a difference in looking at the naming of artists and the way that our artists were actually dealt with in the database. So what we did then is we made a decision to do dual naming. So as you'll see in Ever Present, we've actually incorporated that there, where the language name, for places, we got the original name first, and then we've put the European name second, wherever it's possible. we started incorporating that into the database so that when people, whether it's us or anyone else in the gallery, would print up labels, that information was going to be there. There was no sort of missing of this information, because it's really important. It had a name originally, let's use that. We had many unknown artists, unknown makers, or just unknown in the collection. We felt that this was actually really quite wrong. And so in that same year, with our leadership program, we had a young curator from the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, Zoe Rimmer, who had a women's Tasmanian shell stringing necklace exhibition. And in that exhibition, because it was the community talking about the old materials of their community, they decided to, of course, name their artists' ancestors and not unknown, because they were known. And I've got quite a few photos of labels around the world where, particularly with unknown artists, or how museums and galleries have been dealing with unknown makers, particularly First Nations ones. We've had once known, which I thought was very strange. Because it's like, well, they're once known. Then they've also got, say, for example, with my community, it was a Larrakia maker. Or Larrakia ancestor. So there's many different ways that, so many of us First Nations artists, workers in these institutions are trying to grapple with, because unknown maker is just not right. It never ever felt right, but we didn't quite know how to manage that. So looking at what Zoe had done with her community, of course it made sense. They were our ancestors, they were an elder at some point. And so, getting that approval across the board with the director to actually change for all First Nations to ancestor. And then we just determine whether it's male or female as well, going through that structure. We also had in the collections, which I found offensive, a number of references. So we've got, there's an artist called Deaf Tommy Mungatopi, who's from the Tiwi Islands. We've got Lame Timmy is another reference. We've got a number of sort of descriptors, Lofty Bardiel Najamerik, who's a very tall man who did not like being called Lofty. But they were the artists' names in the collections, and it's like, we don't call Mike Parr one-arm Mike Parr, we don't do this for Western artists. And so, that is a legacy of I don't know, whatever the system was back in the day, but it was like, no, this is offensive, and changing all of those to who they were and whatever their traditional name was. So, Tommy is a Western name, of course. And so dealing with all those sorts of changes, so the artist names down to those basic levels of, recognising them as an ancestor, not just someone that's like, unknown, was really important for the gallery to do as well. So, language font, which is a thing that we're dealing with now. So Yungumata is a particular font that is used in Yirrakala up in Arnhem Land, which plays havoc with poor designers in our institution, but again, that is the font. Yes, it's not a written language, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, but they're starting to develop their own agency and saying, this is the font that we want. This is a font or a typography that actually describes our language a lot better than just English. So, incorporating those sorts of things. So, getting language into the database, which, God love my colleagues in collections, the collections management area, documentation area. It's a real challenge, but we're working through it, and we're finding ways and means of actually incorporating it, because that's how it should have been. Language names for medium. So Yvonne Cormitry is an artist from South Australia who, I'm going back to artists and saying, retrospectively, it's like, well, what's the name for this particular material? What would you have called it? What do you call it in your community? So you have that, you have the English name, and you have the scientific name. So you've got all of that information captured there as well. So it's really important to be able to recognise that this had a name beforehand. Contextualising, I didn't finish that out. The colonisation collecting practices. So we, in our labels, which you may see in the ever-present show as well, is we now put in there, so if instead of date unknown, place unknown, all of that information we say, place made, not collected. We wanted to get away from this like, oh, we just don't know. It's like, well, no, it was deliberately either not collected or actually that's the main message that we want to get across, is that a lot of this information wasn't collected deliberately because, it wasn't considered important whether they're female artists also, or it just wasn't seen as important. So, community-led titling, a lot of the barks that I dealt with were just called bark paintings, 3 kangaroos and a barramundi. That's not how it would have been called. Obviously, it's a descriptor, and it's how the Arts Centre coordinator has actually, or whoever was working there at the time, just said, look, this is it. It's not the title. So we're going back to community and saying, if that person is alive, great. If they're not, then it's like, well, what would you call it? How would you name this? If you were an elder teaching a young person, what would you name this? And looking at how we can incorporate better naming where community are actually leading the titling, getting an awareness that they have the agency to be able to do that they have the right to do that, and bark painting is not a title. So, looking at cultural conditions associated with work. So Alec Tapodi, who's here, he has, even though his work that's in Ever Present is made out of fiberglass, it's a contemporary work or based off an ancestor's head mask from the Torres Strait, from his community. Being the mask and the type of material and the object that it is, traditionally men only would have handled it. So we have applied that to the work in the institution where conservation, installation, registration, only men can handle these particular works. And I have worked with artists and to look through, okay, what are the kind of layerings to it? Because, if there are absolutely no men around that can actually handle it, what do we do with women that may potentially handle it? So with gloves, so it's not skin to object. So, working through these with communities, because I know that particular objects are men's only and there's women only kind of things, or they're associated with, ceremonial practices that only men would do. So another artist that I worked with, who's a Papua New Guinean artist, Eric Bridgman, I spoke to him about some war shields that we actually bought. They were contemporary artworks, but I know that they're war shields that men would have used, and I was assigned to do the paperwork for the acquisition for it, and I spoke to him and I said, look, I'm not comfortable because I know that these were traditionally made for men to be used by men, but I'm a woman doing this, and I ended up getting a young Aboriginal intern in to work on it with me as a training tool for him as well, but to say that this is a men's material. And Eric, talking to him about you can put these cultural conditions on it. It doesn't matter if it's a contemporary work. If this is how you would do it in community, this is how we should be doing it in the museum. And he didn't realise, and he loved that. And now he puts those conditions on his war shields that he creates. And, and so giving that agency back to the artisans of the community, saying, you have every right to be able to name this, and we show this however you want, and we will put that in the database and capture it in some way or another. There was another example when I worked at the National Museum when it opened in 2001. We had a collection of sculptures that were made by the Arakoon community in the 1960s. Beautiful, great, they were going on display. We engaged with the community, and because they had been sitting in the stores for all that time, they wanted to give them life again, and that meant rubbing them with ochre and fats. And we worked very strongly with conservation on that because they just had conniptions about, like, oh my God, what are we going to do? It's like, well, that's how you deal with it. You just have to deal with it. And we look at it, and so they did. They repainted it. They danced with them at the opening. They put life back into them because that's what they were originally used for and made for. So looking at these sorts of ways of actually saying, you know what, this is how would community use it, we need to incorporate that in the database. So that gender-based cultural conditions is one that's coming up more and more as we go. Again, that elder-led methodologies, practices and teachings, how would they teach young people about these things, and what information can we put into the database, because that is the central part, the core area that all of this information should be drawn from. And also, decolonising teachings and perspectives from and by First Nations people. So in Australia, we're very lucky and fortunate to have Genevieve Greaves, who does a 3-day, it's absolutely brilliant, decolonising workshop. And all of our, and the institution made a stance and said, all right, all of our curators, whether they're in Australian or international art, are to do this decolonising workshop to get a better understanding of where we're coming from as First Nations peoples. I don't know if it was really a good or a bad thing, because it just made people more aware of things and more hesitant to do things, but it also put a lot of pressure back on First Nations staff to kind of explain things a bit more. But we're working through that and saying, how can you, in whatever you're dealing with, whichever community that you're dealing with, how can you, indigenise what you do in your practices and as such. So, looking at ways that we incorporate this. So we incorporate this in we've got a First Nations style guide and a terminology, terminology document that we are deliberately not using particular words like settler, because they didn't settle the areas. They were quite confrontational engagements, encounters in community. So, looking at particular terms that we will not use in the extended text, looking at using massacres, slavery, all of these sorts of terminologies where this is what happened. This is about the truth-telling in our country. And so we have made a stance at the National Gallery to be able to incorporate these sorts of stories in our text without traumatising both the First Nations visitors as well as other visitors. But, you don't want to shy away from it. You really don't need to. And also because artists are actually doing a brilliant job of bringing those kinds of stories out through their communities and their individual experiences. And so, and another aspect that we've been looking at too is how we can get more, document that community engagement. So, not all of our communities can write English. English is often a third or fourth language. So how do we make it accessible to them where the information and records and databases have not been accessible to them for all those years? When we opened the displays at the National Museum, when I worked on them, we deliberately, incorporated language and stories and not interpreted it. It's like, well, Aboriginal people have not been able to understand English for all this time. You need to feel that discomfort of not understanding what's going on. You don't want to alienate the public so that they don't engage and understand. But, things like if anyone's going to Documenta this year, Richard Bell has got a fantastic work called Pay the Rent, which is a counter that counts and calculates with compound interest. From Federation, the amount of monies that the Australian government owes Aboriginal people. There's no label, there's no nothing. When you see it, it's right at the front of the building that it's on, and you're forced to engage with it, to go and ask about it. So, looking at ways of, not quite forcing, but, encouraging people to engage with these particular works and these stories. And, so it's important. But, we're looking at video recordings and putting that on the database of artists talking about their works or giving permission. So, loans or copyright permissions. Does it always have to be signed or written or whatnot? Why can't we do video recordings? Why can't we, do audio recordings of people giving permission? And so we've been, I'm sorry, I can't see. 15 minutes? Okay. Like the different ways of actually incorporating First Nations presence in the database. So, having a lot of, there's a whole lot of sort of, storage and issues like that we work through with the institution. But, if we've got an artist whose first language isn't English, let's get a video recording of them giving permission, or, other ways of actually getting that information into the database, where it's not always just, it's got to be typed up. We've got to think outside the box, and there's just so much rich material out there that, whether it's the archival information, whether it's the artists or the communities looking at the archives as well and saying, what can we do with this, and talk about it, because there's those historians that of course say that if it wasn't written, it didn't happen. But of course we know oral histories is continually being, certainly in Australia, being backed up by the scientific evidence of what actually happened in the country. So, looking at really different ways of working with the institution in making it a more meaningful space for, communities to come and engage with, whether it's the different spellings, whatever it might be. There's just a lot of work, and I spend every Friday as part of my role working with the documentation team and registration in continually working on how we can improve the, whether it's capturing the gender, responsibilities, the materials, what happens if there was a bark that happened to, I think it was the natural ochres and that were coming off. Do we collect the ochres that the artist actually used to, repair it with? Do we get the artist back to repair it? We looked at that and contemplated that for an Owen Yellinger, who's in the show as well, but one of his works and that. So, looking at how, okay, if this was in community, how would it be dealt with? And how we can, and it's... What's been wonderful is with our registration conservation staff at work too, they've just been fantastic because they've learning so much from the artists and communities in different ways of actually, engaging with these particular works. If it's not meant to last, then it's not meant to last. That's a part of its degradation. We've got a number of pukamani poles or tuatinis, so ceremonial funerary posts in our gardens that have been there for over 25 years. And the whole point is that it's, and actually only last week we were dealing with, one that's ready to topple over. What do we do with it then? It's like, well, when it topples, it topples. You take it away. You either store it, or we work with the communities to say, what do you want us to do with this wood? You can't leave it out, unfortunately. Kids pick them up and throw them around, but you've got to work out what do we do with the bits that have fallen off these parts of ironwood. We are still working through that, and working with the communities, because traditionally it would have just decayed. So, how do we do it safely for the public, but also, respect the original intention of this particular work. We've now, with the latest, the fourth National Indigenous Art Triennial called Ceremony, one of the artist works is, he's a local man, a traditional man from Canberra region, where we're from. He's carved trees out in the garden. That was his artwork, and that's what they would have done many years ago. And now, of course, the question actually only came up last week. So what happens if the tree dies? Do we keep that carving? Do we let it go? Like there are all these questions that we don't know, and we've put it back to the artist to say, well, what do you want us to do? Do you want the carved bit back? Do we replant another tree in that spot, and the next generations get to carve it, or whatever that might be? So, looking at how we can indigenise not only the collections, but how we actually think about the works. It's how we would deal with them in community is very different to how you would in a museum. And so the staff have been fantastic. The director's been fantastic on this as well. And so looking at, each week there's something different that kind of comes up. But, as I said, for me, the database and capturing all of that, so that when I go, that legacy can kind of live on, and, hopefully with the next generations that are coming through, when, you know, there's a better understanding of what else we can do with these collections. You know, there's a lot of hope for that. And, you know, I mean, honestly, as others have heard and my poor colleagues at work have heard, I could go on about this for hours, about different elements of our database particularly, and talking with my colleagues how they're doing it, how they're making those changes. You know, at the Australian Museum, one of the leadership lads who were in the program at the time, he went back and he changed all of their unknown artists and makers to ancestors. So there's a small ripple effect that's happening, but, you know, there's a lot of work that we need to do, because there's centuries-long museum practices and methodologies that we've just accepted and sort of gone along with and just started using. But now we're working with the database systems developers, or whatever they're called, and saying, okay, we need these other elements. We need to know. You know, now, of course, in our database, we've got different references for gender, or not. And so, you know, looking at how we can incorporate all these different facets of who artists and communities are and what their works are. But I think capturing that, making those changes, which we're seeing in the sorts of exhibitions that we're doing, hopefully people will kind of pick up on that, and that, you know, we've done things, just because we've done things the way that we've done it doesn't mean it's the right way, and we need to, you know, make those changes. So I just wanted to kind of leave on this, that once we contextualise, once we, you know, indigenise these sorts of collections and works and that, you know, it can only enrich society's understanding of who First Nations artists are, how and why and what the works were used for, whether it's an artwork or not. You know, art and culture for us is one and the same. So, you know, for the contemporary artists, understanding that they can actually incorporate this cultural knowledge and association with their works has been really, really quite a wonderful journey to you know, inform artists. If they want to, they can do that. They can name, you know, they can incorporate language, and don't necessarily make these works so that it's easy for sale, if that makes sense, so that it's all in English, so that they understand everything, and that it's like, well, not everything needs to be, you know, interpreted or you know, revealed. But you know, there's enough of us First Nations workers in museums and galleries nowadays to start making these changes. And it's, you know, like I said, when I turned 50, it was like, whatever, I got no time or patience now. It's now our time, and we need to make those changes. So that's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for your insightful sharing. You've left us a lot to think about, even though the context can be very different from the work that we do. But there's so much to think about. And the fact that it's also the hidden aspect of the work that we do, the database. So I'm sure everyone has got some questions to ask. I'd like to maybe propose a more casual and informal way. I'm going to let go of this mic, and I'm going to pass it around if you have a question. But if you don't feel like you have a question because it's too late, we'll just give it a few seconds to see. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pass it around. Thanks.
Hi, Tina. Thanks so much for your talk. I have two questions. The first one is, because you mentioned that there was gender-specific handling of some of the objects. And as you know, currently, gender is fluid. So how would a museum deal with this situation in the future? Actually, not in the future, but right now. And then the second question is, I think you mentioned that in your earlier slide, you had colleagues who are not First Nations, and they misrecognized or did not recognize some of the objects. So I just wanted to also know a bit more, if you could elaborate on, you know, some of the things that are informing some of the, the instances of misrecognition? What is it that we are not getting right,
We're just not seeing right. We're not looking right. But the gender issue is we go by the artist and the community. We've got genderless people in our communities already. We've got sister girls and brother boys, so, they've always been there. But the church has, had an impact on that. But that's, in communities, we know that. But we go by the artist's advice on that and the community. When it comes to it, if it's raised or if we talk to the institution about, if there's, say, genderless people working on it, what would they like us to do? We go by their advice, and I'm pretty certain it would still come down to the gloves, having a layer between. It didn't matter with artists if it was what nationality the male worker was. So long as they were male, they had to be certainly an older male as well, not a younger male, because of initiation and all sorts of other things like that, but just as an older person. We would go by the artist in relation to that. And to your next question, okay, it was again when I turned 50, I was just like, whatever, stirring the pot up everywhere, because we were doing a new Australian art display, and the senior curators, non-Indigenous, were developing these exhibitions. And I would just go into the meeting and say, I don't get it, I don't understand. I said, when I see I'm terrible with my Australian artists, like an Arthur Boyd painting, I said, I will look at that work if it's a landscape work, and all I want to know is, whose country is that? Where are they? And what did it look like before this painting? And any of the colonial paintings or artworks at work, that's all I wanted to know. I didn't want to know who the artist was. I didn't want to know what light they were capturing or whatever. I was not interested in that. That's what I saw. And because my First Nations and my colleagues, my First Nations colleagues, we're all the same. It's like, oh, yeah, of course, we might. And I look into colonial paintings all the time for scar trees. What has the artist unintentionally captured that documents aspects of country? Jonathan Jones, who did the wonderful commission, his stoneworks in the show here, had done a work at Tanandi where he gathered all of these colonial paintings in relation to this work, where he looked at how they were capturing the change in the native grasses because of pastoralism or overgrazing, and they unintentionally captured the change in country. So when we were doing this work, when we were doing these displays, I would challenge them on that. It's like, well, ask those sorts of questions that I wanted to know, but didn't really, bother beforehand. But it's like, all right, first people's first. I want to ask these questions. So I would challenge them about that. And so what we did then, as part of that, because it's quite a shift. If you're not living in a cultural group or whatever, from their perspectives, you're not going to see it. Like, they just did not see that kind of information. They didn't see that, settlers, that's really not the right word for it. It's a standard word that was kind of used and stuff. And so when we did this decolonising workshop, which looks at racial literacy as well as a whole lot of other things, of perspectives of, when was the first time they recognised or experienced racism? Well, no, they didn't. And so, unfortunately, being, one of the First Nations staff in these workshops, that all kind of turn to you, and it's like, well, when I was 3, you tell your experience, they're like, oh, dang, I didn't know that. But they never experienced that. So they never, experienced that discrimination. So it just wasn't a part of their consciousness. So when looking at these works, and now we do that with any, so whether it's another First Nations works from anywhere else in the world, we ask those questions, and they ask those questions now, and it's about, informing them to ask those questions and not just blindly go along as like, oh yes, this is a blah and, you know, this is how we've always done it. No, now it's like, oh, hang on a second. But now, of course, it's bitten me because of the dual naming. And because I've got such a strong interest in it, it's like, Tina, what's the name for this? And it's like, oh my God, I don't have time for this. But, you know, you'll go and engage with community and you'll find out if there is an Aboriginal name for that particular location where this work comes from. And so we're building up this pool of knowledge, of terminology, of, language words and things like that, that community at the time have kind of endorsed that we use. So now there's a lot more awareness. We're starting to, and talking before, we've got these particular festivals and events that we have in Australia that are just First Nations focused. We're starting to take our colleagues to these and introduce them to artists and people to say, go and build your relationships. It's not my job to bring you up to speed. Like if I want to know about the police union, I'm not going to go to any, white person and say, tell me about the police union. I'm going to go and research that. So, likewise, any cultural knowledge, it's like, well, make an attempt. Go and do that and have that, awareness to go and do that first up. So, yeah, it's a process that we're going through and it's great and all, but yes, it is fatiguing on First Nation stuff because it still comes back to us like, oh, where else can I go? What else can I do? Because they're just not in that realm that we are. So, but it's been brilliant. It's been great. And, there was a lot of... Belongings was the first show that we'd done. We'd done another one called Storylines where First Nations perspectives, where particular works like, well, this is Larrakia country, unceded Larrakia country that, this particular artist has painted. So we will note those sorts of things. And artists are actually bringing out those stories in their artist statements too. So, it's a fast but rewarding journey, I think, towards the end. But yeah, those sorts of awareness trainings, I think have made such a difference to certainly our First Nation, non-Indigenous staff at work. But yeah, it can be a bit fatiguing, quite fatiguing sometimes, so yeah.
Hi Tina, thank you so much. I wanted to ask if any of the cataloguing practices at National Gallery of Australia that you developed for First Nations have been used in any of the other sections of the museum, because they also have very encyclopedic kind of collections, including of Asian collections and pre-modern or colonial Asian collections that would have also had a lot of kind of unrecorded information or unknown maker. So have any of the kind of systems or naming conventions that you developed for First Nations been kind of addressed in those other parts of the museum as well?
I believe so, honestly, because I've got so much work in my realm. I haven't really kind of focused too much on that, but we have conversations all the time with our colleagues in those other, the Pacific and the Asian art departments and that. Like I said, they had all done the decolonising workshop as well, and so just to kind of get an understanding across the board, because it's just, basic human rights and courtesy to kind of deal with people with with empathy and with a little bit of understanding, even just to stop, listen and kind of learn. So I'll have to go back and check that, but yeah, I believe that it has been because when we're doing these sort of shows where international works are there as well. Actually, I think it is, yeah, because when it comes to ancestors, they've had that as well, because you just kind of skim through and you think, yep, no, this is how it is, or it might be kind of, slightly different. But yeah, it's along those same lines that, it's a whole of institution sort of focus. But yeah, I'll definitely go back and look a bit closer, I think, yeah.
Hi Tina, thank you for the insightful sharing so far. So I have one question about documentation itself. I mean, even though as offensive as it is, it's still part of the documentation, part of the history. So how does your department in that sense deal with this kind of documentation?
Yeah, that legacy is still captured, and we note down, thankfully, I don't know if that's a good thing or not, being a Virgo, I capture everything. So like and so you need to say that, and that's what my colleagues, God love them, they're not interested in that, but, capture everything. So Tina Baum, Curator, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art, on this date, through this email, I will put the email on the multimedia record as well. I will track everything on the parties records for the artist. If there's a name change, because often when artists die, their names change. And, it can be forever and it can be for a certain amount of time. So all of that is captured on all of the aspects of it. But that legacy is important as well because, oh gosh, we were probably pushing the boundaries a little bit too much with the Australian art hang, where we were saying, these Arthur Boyd, whatever, I don't know, one of the Australian artists, colonial artists' works, it's like, this title is terrible, it's not reflective of what's going on, and blah, 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 with First Nations works, and we were proposing to change it, but of course you can't. But, we're looking at how we capture that on labels and saying, this is the original title, but, this is like a community perspective kind of title of it and that. So those sorts of things are captured and documented as rigorously as we possibly can. And it's important to look at that legacy to see why. Why was it, bark paintings, and trying to look at what the kind of museum standards is of how you actually, write it out instead of saying, well, this is not bark, the title's not bark painting, that's crap. It's now this, so capturing it as best that we can to say that, it's not reflective of the work, it's inappropriate. We've engaged with these people on this date, and this is the title that they've come to, and now we will use that. So whether it's, saving all of those documents on the multimedia, tab, wherever it is, it's that legacy is important as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I could talk about this forever. I love it. But yeah, I think, hopefully there's a ripple effect across the country where we're working on it with our leadership, alumni of 120 of them. So yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question about restricted information. How do you make sure that the right information gets to the right people on the database? And if it is made public, like put online, that you distinguish who gets the right information?
Yeah, we have different, and I don't have time in the 1 hour, but we have restricted paintings. So from the Papunya community, we went to the community and said, look, we've got these works, we want to engage with you to see which ones are restricted, because in the early days in the 70s when the community, the men painted these paintings, of course they painted them for themselves, not for commercial sales, decades down the track where restricted material information is in these works. How do we deal with this? So we've got a number that are actually restricted that only men can see. And so we've got, we've worked up systems with the with staff where there's a replacement image that's put up that no one can see that work anymore until community have given clearance to it. There's other areas where the with rights and permissions, so certain staff can see only certain things on the database because they can restrict it in how you can access information or change information as such. So there might be a general note that this is a restricted work. You need to speak to whoever about accessing that information, or for some of the information in the database, you actually need community permission to access it. And so that's all noted down, and they're those sorts of cultural plans, I suppose, that relate to those particular works. But there's those ones, there's 21 restricted paintings that we have at the moment that we will go back quite regularly, so every 10 years or so, go back to the community and say, what's the status of these works now? Do they change? Do they come back? Because the younger generation have a different view to the older, who, were of course around at that time when they were painted. And for some of the younger ones, say for example, it's like, well, look, unless you're from that community and you're initiated, you're not going to be able to read that. Just don't highlight it. We've got restricted information for particular works that, that are in there, but they are locked somehow. I don't know how they do it, but they do it. They lock it. And we tell them, like, as curators, we say, no, this information's there, it's great and locked. And, staff ask and say, well, why is this, why is that? And I had one colleague who actually got really cranky. I don't know why. It's like, why, it's just not fair that the women can't do blah, blah. I'm like, don't worry, the women have got theirs. The men have got theirs, you just deal with it. And it comes down to storage as well. So it's not just on the database. It's like, well, these things need to be stored in a particular way if it's relevant to it. Where they're not stored, in a particular way or next to something else. Say, for example, red ochre in some communities is highly, highly powerful material, whereas it's not so much in other communities. And so understanding that and talking to communities about, how do we deal with that? How do we document it? And then working with the documentation team and the database or the people who make the system to say, okay, we need this. Is this something that can, we can incorporate? Because we've got things like the, we do the Getty thesaurus for things which doesn't actually cover a great deal of on the context tab for our understandings and beliefs, because I don't want to put myths down for cultural knowledge. It's like, it's not a myth to us, it's very real. So I refuse to put those sorts of terms to it. So, working with people on what's appropriate. So we've got the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, their thesaurus that is incorporated into our database that covers all of those subjects. But then how we deal with that on the web and how does that come up and all those sorts of things. So they're all kind of hand in hand, but, the working with the documentation team about access rights and permissions is crucial to this as well. And we do have both the male and a female on the documentation team, and we've made sure that was important too, because the female staff can't deal with the restricted materials, so the men do. So yeah. So we're just kind of, we work through things as they come up, but we've worked through quite a lot of things over the years, and how we can make it more culturally appropriate for communities and artists that we deal with. Yeah. That helps. Any other questions? If you ever come to Canberra, I'd love to show you. Be happy to show you. We do try to reflect a lot of this in the ever-present content and the text and that as well. And for editors, our editors now are really good in gaining an understanding. Like we do spellings of like community with a capital C, elders with a capital E, because they are important to us. They're not a lowercase, they're an uppercase. So things like that we have embedded in the gallery, where it's understood across the board, marketing, communications, everybody has access to that First Nations style guide. And, it's reinforced at every step of the way. So thank you.
Thanks again, Tina, for entertaining all the questions. For those of you who have not visited the exhibition, Ever Present runs until 25th of September. If you have visited, come again, bring your friends. But actually, I'd like to take this opportunity to quickly tell and share that we have exciting programs this and next weekend. Tomorrow and Sunday, we have the Damu Kodal group that is led by Alec Tepodi, who will be doing a dance performance right here, one floor down at the Singapore Courtyard, 2:30 p.m. It's free, just come on Saturday or on Sunday. We also have a talk by Professor Lynette Russell and Dr. Lily Yulianti Farid from Monash, and they'll be discussing the historical connection between Makassar and also the First People of Australia. Next Saturday, we have two exciting programs. Tina will be leading a tour, a curator's tour at 11 a.m. And then thereafter at 3:30 p.m., we will have Richard Bell in conversation with our director, Dr. Eugene Tan. So please do make it. Thanks a lot for joining us and spending all your precious hours on a Friday night. And thanks a lot, Tina.